Hey writers, you are listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Laura, one of Kobo Writing Life's author engagement managers.
And I'm Rachel, Kobo Writing Life's other author engagement manager. On today's episode, we chatted with author Clare Leslie Hall. Clare is a novelist and journalist who lives in the wilds of Dorset, England, with her family. Under the name Clare Empson, she published 2 domestic noir thrillers, Him and Mine, that were published in the UK and Germany. Broken Country, her upcoming novel, is her US debut.
We had a great conversation with Clare about her journey to publishing, her writing process, and of course, her new release, Broken Country, which Rachel and I both loved, and how the idea for the book really came to her. This episode was an awesome chat about craft, and we can't wait for you to take a listen.
All right, we are joined today by author Clare Leslie Hall. Clare, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Can you start us off just by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Clare. Broken Country is my US debut, but I'd actually published 2 novels before under my married name, which is Clare Empson. And I've always wanted to be a novelist, but it took me quite a long time to get here, as you will find out. I spent the first half of my career as a journalist working on newspapers. I live in Dorset in the southwest of England with my husband and my children in an old farmhouse surrounded by fields, which inspired the setting of Broken Country.
You spoke a little bit about your background as a journalist. How did you transition from there to your novels?
I wrote as a child non-stop. I sort of grew up in a family of readers. My parents were teachers, and we used to have the long summer holiday, and I've got 2 older sisters, and we would go to 2 different libraries at the start of each week in 2 different towns, take out our maximum reading quota, and then we'd just go home and read. That was how we spent our holidays, and I was obsessed with books, and I was obsessed with writing. My dad used to bring home these scrap notepads from his office, and I would just fill them with stories. But I just assumed after university I did an English degree that I would need to get a job that was, something to do with writing. So I became a journalist. And I would say during my 20s, I didn't do any creative writing. I think they just felt like such different disciplines. I was a news journalist, and it's quite formulaic, and I just didn't feel I could do both. But then when I hit 30, I thought, okay, we can't put this off any longer. So I started writing what was really scenes. So I started writing creatively again. And then, I just kept on going and kept writing novels and kept on as a journalist, doing both things. I was a freelance at this time because I'd started a family, and then eventually I just realised I had to put all my energies into writing a novel, and that's what I did. And that novel took 7 years. My last child was 6 weeks old when I started it, and I think he was almost 9 when it got published. So if that answers the question, it was a long and winding route.
Now, I'm curious because you mentioned that journalism, especially news journalism, which, like you said, is a little bit on the formulaic side, and prose, they're so different. Did your career in journalism influence your prose writing and vice versa? Once you started creative writing again, did you find that impacted how you wrote for the news journalism side of your career?
I actually think it has. I think I have quite a sort of simple style of prose. I've never done any creative writing courses, and I when I look back, I wish I had, really. I think I could have saved myself quite a lot of pain. But the only thing I did do, actually, when I was writing Broken Country, was I went on do you know what Arvin is? Have you heard of Arvin? Arvin is in the UK, and it was founded by Ted Hughes, the poet, and it's a sort of creative writing retreat. And most writers who go there are starting out, they're not published. But there's somebody called Will Self, who, I don't know if you know of him, but he's an author and a journalist in Britain, quite well known here. And he was running a course about place. So I went on this Arvin course while I was writing Broken Country. And it was really interesting, actually, because he analysed a sort of, you had to give your tutor an excerpt of writing. And I gave him the opening to Broken Country, and he was very nice about it. But he also said, ooh, journalese, you know, so he could see the things that he felt were quite lazy and journalistic. So I definitely think it's influenced my style. And I also think not always in a good way. Sometimes I have to make more of an effort to be poetic.
What was the journey like for you from when you began writing your novels to your actual publication?
I got published when I was 50 and I started when I was 30. So there you go, 2 hard decades with a young family as well, and working as a journalist. I just had a lot of quite close calls. I had 2 agents in that time, and I was just always, I was learning the craft, I would say, through rejection and trial and error and picking myself up. But I think I just really didn't know about structure and pacing. I knew how to write, and I was into creating characters, and I live in my imagination most of the time. You know, it goes back to those days of reading. You know, I like to be in a sort of fictional world, but there were things that I really probably didn't get, and that was structure, pacing, tension. I think I always wrote quite instinctively in a 3-act structure. I think that must just be from reading and from learning Shakespeare at school. It just, my novels have always fallen into that sort of beginning, middle and end. But one of the best things I did, so I do remember with him, my first novel, that took, I'm going to say, I was probably about 6 years in, and I still had, you know, quite young children. And my husband would really sweetly sort of take them away for the weekend so that I could write. And I remember feeling very conflicted because he'd send me these photos and they were in a woods and the children were sort of hanging upside down on rope swings. And I was like, oh, you know, I'm here and I'm missing out. And I remember having this moment in the middle of the night when I just thought, should you stop? You know, maybe you should stop, because it was so painful. And then I realized, you know, I asked myself, could you stop? And I realized that I couldn't, and that it was, you know, it's who I am and what I do, and that whether I got published or not, I must carry on writing. I always would. And I would always pick myself up again, and I would always keep trying. And quite soon after that, I sent my novel to a freelance editor, and that was completely life-changing, because there were all the things that I didn't understand laid out for me about structure, pacing, tension, this extraneous characters, too many settings, too many themes. And it was just like a crash course. I guess it's what I might have learned if I'd gone on a proper creative writing course or done an MBA. So that was absolutely brilliant. And quite soon after that, I got my agent, and I think we did 2 quite big, not that big, but a couple of edits, and then I got my first book deal.
I think it's like admirable, the fact that you learned as you wrote, but then you had to face so many no's, but still managed to pick yourself up and keep writing and keep writing. Publishing in general can be a very hard industry to break into. There's a lot of no's before you get that big yes. Do you have any advice for the authors who are trying to get through to that first yes, and how to kind of take the rejection that can come with trying to get published and move forward?
Yeah, it's just so painful, but I think, I know everybody says this, but it's just true, and I am a case in point. It's just persistence, and I think it's not giving up, and I think you have to allow yourself both things. When you get rejected, it's really painful, and you have to have a break and say, I'm never going to do this again. But then you have to realize that actually you are going to do this again, and maybe if you're lucky, you're going to learn something from what people have said about the novel that didn't get picked up. And really, it's just keeping going. And I gave up quite a lot, over those 20 years. There were huge, maybe even a whole year here and there. It was always a thing I passionately wanted, but sometimes it is too painful. So I think it's a combination of having breaks when you need it psychologically. And also a really big tip, and I think I've only just learned this myself, is to be kind to yourself. Because it's so easy to sort of slightly beat yourself up and just to believe that the rejection, to take it so personally, and you think, oh, well, then I must be rubbish. But actually, it's incredible. You really learn this from looking at your reviews, that one man's meat is another man's poison. It's like people could be raving about your book, and then other people could absolutely loathe it. And it's the same with agents, and it's the same with editors. It's just completely subjective, and it doesn't mean that you're not a great writer. It just means it wasn't for that particular person, and you have to keep going and keep going. Another thing I would say that really, really helped me early on was forming a writers group. By this stage, I just moved to the country, to Dorset, where we are now. So this was 17 years ago. And I'd already had an agent, and actually 2 agents. And the last agent had put my book out and it hadn't had a deal. And then I got dropped. So I'd had that thing of thinking, wow, I'm there, I've made it, I've done it. And then not at all. So I was pretty despondent. But I read Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. Do you know that book? It's wonderful.
Yeah.
And she really recommended forming a writers group. And I then I had lunch with these 2 women who I didn't know, but I really got on well with. And it turned out that they'd been on a short story writing course. And I said, shall we form a writers group? And we did. And it was absolutely brilliant. My youngest child was a baby. And so they used to come to me once a week at lunchtime, and we would have our group for the time that he slept. And I remember that first one so well, because we'd each written something for it. It was probably the opening of my novel, and it was nerve-wracking reading out our writing to each other. But it really raised the bar for me, because I remember thinking how good they were and how beautiful their prose was. And so then I tried a lot harder for the next week. But it's not really about that. It's about the support, because it's so lonely when you're trying, and when you haven't got a deadline, and you don't know anybody in publishing, and you just don't know why you're doing it, but you just know that you're compelled to write. So it's absolutely brilliant sharing the highs and lows with other writers. So I hugely recommend it.
I love that. And kind of like you mentioned, writing is such a solitary experience. So having other people in that creative process with you, I imagine, makes it much less isolating.
Yeah, it really does. And it's so much fun as well, because you just discuss your novels. And, actually, we ended up being incredibly close and discussing all sorts of things as well. But, you're all passionate about the same thing. And you can brainstorm your plots, plus you read each other's work. It helps. It's like it teaches you how to edit and how to take criticism, I suppose. It's such a good thing.
I'm a little bit curious, because you've mentioned you published 2 books before Broken Country, which we are going to get into, which is your upcoming release, but you published them under a different pen name. So I'm curious why you decided to use Clare Leslie Hall for Broken Country.
Yeah, good question. So Clare Empson is my married name. I published my first 2 novels, him and mine. And what happened there, you sort of think this is another case of thinking that you've done it and you've got there. But what actually happened to me with him and mine was that I would say that I would say I'm positioned as writing book group fiction or dark love stories. I think I've always written dark love stories, but they've also crossed genre, because I like suspense as well. And we're in the UK, him and mine were positioned as thrillers. And, at the time I was like, sure, I can be a crime author, even though I'd never really even read thrillers at that point and didn't consider myself a crime writer. But I was so thrilled to get a book deal. But what actually happened there was that I think I felt very stymied by that tag, because I just don't think I'm naturally a thriller writer. So when it came to creating Broken Country, I really wanted to move away from crime fiction. And so it just felt like I should have a new name. But interestingly, I remember the first time around, I remember my agent saying, this book is one of the hardest I've ever had to pitch, because it's so many different things. But when it came to Broken Country, I think this is just, maybe the market has changed, or maybe I've just grown into being the kind of writer that I am without apology, and not trying to fit into any particular label. But my agent pitched Broken Country as a love story with the pulse of a thriller. So she sort of almost made a virtue of the fact that it crosses genres. So there you go. It seemed to work.
You've been quite open about the length of time that it took to write Broken Country, when the inspiration hit, and then how long it took to tell the story that you wanted to tell. Can you talk a little bit about the writing process there, and what was it about this story that kind of kept drawing you back in?
Yeah, so Broken Country, actually that was him I was talking about, the first one. Broken Country took 4 years, and the idea came while I was writing my second novel, and my husband was out running in the fields behind our house with my youngest son's puppy, and it was lambing season, and the farmer, he strayed into a field of sheep and lambs, and the farmer threatened to shoot him. Luckily that didn't happen, but within minutes of talking about it, this very vivid scene came into my head, and I could actually sort of picture the farmer and his wife in their field of sheep, and a young boy running towards them, chasing after his lost dog. And for some reason, I knew that the boy reminded them of the son they'd lost, and I could also sense that there was an attraction between the boy's father and the farmer's wife. And I was sort of in the middle of this other novel, but there was this big shiny idea, and I was desperate to write it. It was a love triangle. I've never really had something come into my head as clearly as that spark. But then, of course, it came to the writing of it. Yeah, it was really hard to get right. And I wrote for 2.5 years. Broken Country, which is set in the 50s and 60s, was actually a contemporary novel when I started it. And it's a love triangle between Beth, Frank, and Gabriel. And Frank and Gabriel had voices in for those 2 years, as well as Beth. And something about it wasn't quite landing. And actually, it got rejected by my previous editor, who I'd worked with him in mind. She said, I love it, but it's gone too, I think it was too literary, too experimental. And this was just a symptom, I think, of me trying to write my way out of crime fiction. And even my agent said, I think you should put this down and start something else. So, which was heartbreaking. But I did start writing another book. So I had a couple of quite big breaks. And then I just suddenly saw how I had to do it. And it was Beth's story, only Beth. And she was a woman torn between two men. And I also it just felt like it should be 50s. It felt period to me. So I decided to set it in the 50s and 60s. And then there was one other thing which I felt was sort of, I had to be quite brave to do. And that was, I'd had this thought about creating a murder trial, but I don't think I'd read, apart from To Kill a Mockingbird, I'd never really read a courtroom drama. And so I went to the Old Bailey, which is a very famous old courthouse in London, and watched a murder trial for a week, because you can sit in the public gallery. And it was really inspiring and kind of fascinating, actually, seeing the drama and the sort of the whole pomp of the court. And so I came home and wrote my own version of a murder trial. And suddenly it really came together. It took 4 years, and it took attempts, and it took stopping. I really think it took those 2 breaks I had, which were probably 3 months each time, to actually step away and suddenly think, light bulb, this is how you have to do it. And I'm sort of constantly interested, and I don't know what the answer is to this question, but when should you stop writing something? You know, like as I was advised to, when should you stop something and it's a relief and it's not working? And when do you just keep going, keep persisting, keep redrafting? In the case of Broken Country, I'm so grateful that I did go back to it.
Well, we're grateful as well that you went back to it because we really enjoyed reading it. Can we talk a little bit about the title? Where did the title Broken Country come from?
I think it literally just sort of came quite late on, and I wanted something poetic and a little bit esoteric, and it just came into my head really. And I think it's about a marriage that is broken, and it's also about the countryside and a sort of farming community that's quite divided between the sort of the haves and the have-nots. And so it was all of those things, really. It wasn't anything specific, but it was mainly the fact of Beth's life being broken. And I wanted the title to have a sort of pastoral feel to it, because the landscape and is so important in the novel. And so, yeah, that's how it came.
I would like to touch on kind of the writing process of writing the book, for lack of better words. So for our listeners who haven't had a chance to read it yet, the story is kind of split into 3 different time periods. You have the before, and then 1968, and then the trial. And I'm curious, when it came to sitting down and writing the book, did you write it in the order in which it appears on the page? Did you jump around in timeline when writing? Like, how did you plot all of these different elements of the story?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big plotter. I do try sometimes, you know, I'll read books, but it doesn't really work for me. I think I always have some big, powerful, emotional scenes in my head that I'm writing towards. And then I'll just I just started a new draft actually, so I kind of know how I'm doing it at the moment, and that it is the headlamp method, when you just kind of look 3 scenes ahead. But with Broken Country, I was writing in the 2 timelines, so consecutively 1955, 1968. So I was always doing that. But the trial, I actually wrote, there was always the opening trial scene, and then it came in a chunk at the end. And then it was only quite far in, I realised that the trial would really help with the pacing of the novel. And so then I decided to split it up and put it throughout the book.
Very effective, I will say.
Yeah, I was quite resistant to doing that. I think it might have been my agent who suggested it, and I was like, no, I don't want to do that. But actually, it was the right thing, definitely.
The book is also divided into sections. Each of them are named after a man or a boy in Beth's life. Why did you decide to split up the book that way?
I think it just sort of made sense to me to sort of have a focus on a different character each time. And I quite like what I was trying to achieve with the novel, because it's a love triangle and Beth is torn between her farmer husband, Frank, and her first love, Gabriel. The challenge I set for myself was, I hoped that the reader would be torn. So in the first section, in the sort of 1955, when Beth meets Gabriel and falls in love with him, I hope that the reader would be really sort of swept up in that romance and want her to be with him. But then I would be moving in the next chapter to 1968, when she's happily married to Frank, who's a very good man. So I hoped, and that was the challenge I set myself, was that you would be torn between each section all the way through. And so I hoped that it would sort of, it would pivot, you know, you'd be wanting her to be with Gabriel, and then, because actually, funnily enough, even though, and I no spoilers, I always knew who she would end up with, there were moments when I felt completely torn myself, and wanted a different outcome. So that's what I was trying to achieve with those 2 different timelines. And actually, so Jimmy, who is, I think, the 4th part, that came late too. I hadn't realised I was going to do a section for him, but he became a sort of bigger character as the book went on, and I love it when that happens. I think it comes for me really, quite far into. I'm a big redrafter, so who knows, but maybe draft 5 or 6, these characters start to become bigger, and I love that. When I'm surprised by them.
Yeah. Well, I think we found it really effective as readers, because I know before we started recording the podcast, Rachel and I were talking about the different sections and how each one kind of gives you a question that you're wondering and wanting answered throughout the book, like what happened with Gabriel and like what broke them up, kind of thing. So it's good to keep the reader interested, for sure. It was very effective.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
I'm curious, you mentioned that the book wasn't always written in Beth's POV. Originally, there was a little bit of, like, you had Frank and you had Gabriel. How did the story change when you shifted everything into Beth's POV?
Do you know, it changed quite a lot, really. It simplified, and it really simplified. I think when there was much more, so Frank, I think I'm so glad I did it, because I think it made me understand the essence of Frank. But I would say that there was far more in his voice about farming, much more about farming issues, and his sort of repressed guilt and grief and those kinds of things. It just simplified, the story simplified when I did it into just Beth. And also it was a contemporary story, and then suddenly it was set in the past, and that really helped me to focus on her struggle. So not just the fact that she's a woman torn between 2 men, but also the fact that she's a girl in 1955 from a sort of relatively modest background, compared to Gabriel, who is born into immense wealth and elitism. And it helped me to sort of show how the door closes on Beth quite, it's very easy for her life to get knocked off kilter. Whereas Gabriel, everything he wants, he gets, that's just because he's born to it. So I think it really helped me focus much more tightly on Beth. And it was a big change, but once I knew that it was what I needed to do, it felt very liberating, actually. I wrote the first draft with just Beth very quickly, and I remember saying to my husband, I suddenly knew, and I suddenly got that opening, which is the farmer is dead. We were on holiday, and I just got up and I just wrote it, and I'm like, oh, I think this could be it. And then I wrote the next sort of 10,000 words so fast, and I remember saying to him, I can see the whole story. I can just see it, like from A to Z, the whole thing. So strange, but I had to go through quite a lot to get there.
That's so cool. I'm also just kind of curious, because you mentioned going to the courthouse to kind of do your research for the murder trial aspect of the book. Did you have to do any research on farming? Because even though it's not Frank's point of view anymore, there is still a lot of farming in the book.
So much, yeah. And I think this is something else I would say as a tip, certainly that for myself, which is I think the best thing is to be brave, and bravery in writing. For me, taking on something that I didn't know, like farming, was in a way a small act of, a lot of research and being brave, because I knew nothing about farming. But I was so lucky, and I met some amazing farmers. I went milking, learned how to milk cows, which was very difficult. I found it anyway. And I helped birth a lamb. I went lambing and harvesting. And it was just incredible, because it's such hard work, but it really made me understand what drives the farmers, because I also stayed with a couple on a small holding, and I could understand from them there's just such hard work, not much money, but they would never conceive of, no holidays, but they would never conceive of doing anything else. And when I was with those farmers, I remember the farmer's wife that I stayed with taking me to this hide and look out, and so we were watching these nesting kestrels, and that was something that she chose to do because she was obsessed with the wildlife. And with each farmer, there would always be something magical in the midst of this hard work. And so I think that's really what I took away from it. It sort of enabled me to understand the characters of Frank and Jimmy, and Beth to a certain extent, because she becomes so immersed in the landscape. But I did a lot of research which didn't make it into the book. But somehow having all those hours with the farmers just made me understand what it was like.
It definitely added to the authenticity. And I think the farm and like the whole setting kind of became its own character almost, and really took on its own life in the book. So it was really good. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the ending. So you mentioned you always knew who Beth would end up with. Did you always see the full ending fleshed out in your head, or did some parts of it change for you throughout the writing? Yeah,
some parts did change. And actually, one of the big twists, which I won't say any more than that, but there are a couple of very big twists that come towards the end of the novel. And one of them, it's funny, I sort of put it on Instagram so I can I know when I got that twist. And actually at the beginning of the novel, I thought about it, and then I thought, no, way too difficult to pull off. And then I remember I was out walking the dog, and I just thought, of course, it's the only way it can be. And I'm sorry, I know that's very vague, but I don't want to give any spoilers. But basically, that ending came quite late. I was sort of working towards the ending of the trial, but I remember writing what is the final chapter really quite late on, and so it changed, it evolved, I would say.
I think the answer was vague enough that if you haven't read the book, there is zero spoilers, zero chance of spoilers. But if you've read the book, I think we're picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah.
And also, if you haven't read the book, it's enough that you want to read the book, because now you want to hear about the twists.
Laura kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but there are so many elements of mystery kind of planted throughout the story, and not necessarily in a like crack the case vibe, but in a like I need to know what happened kind of energy. Like, for example, the book opens and, like you mentioned, it's Beth and Gabriel falling in love, but in the, like, we'll say present for lack of a better term, she's with Frank. So it's, what happened to Beth and Gabriel? And then you learn about Bobby, and it's what happened to Bobby, who is on trial, who has been killed. All of these questions kind of build up. And I'm really curious, how did you pace the reveals to readers so it doesn't feel like, it's answer after answer after answer? They're peppered in throughout the book to keep people going. And I'm curious what that process was like.
Yeah, I think, again, I'm afraid it's probably not very helpful, but I think it's instinctive for me, as I think cliffhangers are instinctive. And I think I always knew that I didn't want to reveal too much. And the only thing I can say is that when you have your copy edit, which is it's been through all the editor, and then it goes through copy editor. And because I had two timelines and the trial, which is also a different timeline, I knew that there were going to be some serious questions and about the timeline. And I knew that the copy editor would want to button down a lot of detail. But I also knew that if I was too clear cut in the narrative about what happened when, those final twists we're talking about might become too apparent. So I shrouded quite a lot of detail, I think, hopefully giving enough that you're asking questions, but not enough that you're thinking, hang on a minute, that doesn't make sense. So it had to be quite nuanced, and I had to fight a bit of a battle to make sure that those twists were protected.
And you've mentioned that you're not much of a plotter. You said the headlamp method, which I love. And you also had a lot of drafts. Were there any instances where you were writing and you had like a good chunk of the story set and then a reveal came to you and it completely changed the narrative from the beginning onward? Or was it all kind of a natural flow and you kind of understood where the story was going?
A bit of both, to be honest. Well, an example of where that happened was the murder trial, because I didn't include that until maybe 2.5 years into writing, if not 3. So quite late on for something that is really quite significant in the book. And it was sort of like it snuck up on me, and I was thinking about it, thinking, ooh, there is a man who's died, that at the beginning, and it would be good, but I was probably like dismissing it, thinking that's way too hard, and then I had to do it. So there are definitely always surprises all the way through the writing process. If you were to see my first draft and the final draft, I would say only maybe 3 or 4 scenes came across. I always had the love triangle at its heart, because that was what I saw at the very beginning. And they were always grieving a lost child. And there was always a dog and a dog shooting, which I think we can say because it's very early on. But the rest of it, I think you wouldn't recognise. So yeah, it changed dramatically. But I sort of love that, because I'm writing a new draft now, just started. And I think the reason I don't plot, I have tried to follow sort of things like Save the Cat, etc., but just doesn't work for me, is because I love the surprise, and I love it when you get that buzz, when you think, oh, of course, it should be this. So I really think the reason to write for me is to have fun and to remember that sort of immersion that I felt as a child. When I was writing stories, that it's very easy when you're writing a first draft, because it doesn't ever turn out the way of the shining idea in your head, to get despondent. But I think it's also really important to keep it fun and to keep the joy in it. And this time around, I'm determined that if it's not going well, I'm just going to either walk away and not just sit there. That's the thing, not to just not sit there and sort of wrestle with something. It's fine to walk away. It's really important with writing to just keep the joy, because that is the only reason to do it, is to enjoy it, really.
I think that's great advice.
I kind of want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier and loop it into what you just said, because you mentioned that when you were writing Broken Country, you kind of had a moment of like, do I keep going with this book? Like, is it, or do I give up and walk away? But the story pulled you back in. Kind of similarly, you're a drafter, and so you write a lot of drafts. When do you know you have the final draft? Or when do you know, like, okay, I need to stop being finicky, I need to let this live?
Well, I think I don't always know. I remember doing a second draft of the new version, probably like draft number 10 or something, but second draft for my agent. And I was like, yeah, it's great. It's really working. And I showed it to my husband. He was like crying on the train when he's reading it. He was like, it's amazing. And then I gave it to my agent, and back came these notes, and they were just so extensive. So, and I had to do quite a lot there on the pacing, and so I had no idea really. I mean, I had an idea. Of course, it was not that far off, but there was a lot of more work that needed to be done. By the final draft, I think I knew. I think you just do know when something's ready. Yeah. So, but it does help having an agent or an editor who will pull out things that you sort of. It's always things that somehow deep down you know that, but you haven't you need somebody else to point it out. I think it's amazing having an editor's eyes on it, because I think they read in a different way.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was on the Simon & Schuster website, it mentions that The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley was an inspiration for the book. Are there any other books that have inspired your writing career or your writing style, maybe?
Yeah, I love Atonement by Ian McEwan, and I definitely had that in the back of my mind when I was writing Broken Country. A book that I absolutely loved. I don't know if you'll know it because it's English. Do you know I Captured the Castle? By Dodie Smith. It was actually written, I think, in the 40s or 50s. And I remember my mum gave it to me when I was 10. It is an adult book, but it's sort of beloved by teenagers. And it's a story about a young girl who lives in this sort of decrepit castle with her author father and her beautiful older sister, and she writes it in a diary form, and it's very funny, and it's about this eccentric family. And even though it could be quite dated because it was written in the 40s, 50s, it just isn't. And that book, it blew my mind when I read it at 10, and then I read it every year many times since, and I still read it. So I would say it gave me the sort of taste for family novels. I love novels about families. And perhaps even, she has such an authentic voice. She's called Cassandra. And so I think it also gave me the taste for writing in first person. I often start a novel writing in third person, which is the kind of great tradition, isn't it, of sort of Jane Austen or Thomas Hardy or whatever it is. But I almost always end up going back to first. So I think that book definitely influenced me.
Those are some great recommendations for sure. I've been meaning to read I Capture the Castle. Maybe this is my sign that I need to actually get it done this year.
Oh, you'll love it. I think you would love it. It's so romantic, and it's funny, and it really it's so atmospheric. It's just wonderful.
One of the last things I wanted to touch on was the Broken Country film, because we've heard that Hello Sunshine is set to produce a Broken Country movie. What was it like to find out that a movie would be coming?
Oh gosh, I mean, it was just amazing. It was absolutely amazing. The whole process of being on submission was amazing because it sort of seemed to sort of snowball a bit, and it was so exciting. And I think after about 2 weeks, my agent said, Hello Sunshine and Sony would like to have a call with you. And I couldn't believe it because, I absolutely love everything that Hello Sunshine does. And it's the dream. Of course, it's the dream. But, it seems like a very far off, unrealistic dream. But I'm so excited that it's happened. I can't wait to see the characters on screen because it's funny with Broken Country, perhaps because I think I'm a very visual writer. I can always picture every scene exactly. I can sort of see it as it is and where they are, and not so much the faces of the characters, but the setting. And with Broken Country, it's just like a film in my head. I can see every single scene because a lot of it is set here where I live. And so I'm so excited to think that I might actually see, their interpretation of it on the screen. It'll be amazing. And I think if it happens, it will happen. It will be filmed here. So that's really exciting.
Have you allowed yourself to cast any of the characters with actors, or are you not putting that energy out there?
Oh, I have. I very much doubt that it will come to be. But funnily enough, towards the end of writing, way before I even considered that it could be a film, I had Daisy Edgar-Jones in my head for Beth. I think she looks just right, and I loved her in the Crawdads movie. And so because of Daisy, I think Paul Mescal would make an amazing Frank. Do you know Paul Mescal?
Of course.
Yes, yeah. And then I laugh with my US editor about this because she doesn't agree with me at all. But I think maybe Timothy Chalamet would make a good Gabriel.
Ooh, I could see it.
I could see that for sure. Yeah.
Or Jacob Elordi from Saltburn.
Yeah.
I think would be really excellent.
I think they could both do like moody writer, artsy writer very well.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I think so too. And then I think an interesting role would be Tessa Wolff, Gabriel's mother. And someone like Keira Knightley or Rosamund Pike would be fantastic in that role.
I love it. Producers at Hello Sunshine, if you're listening, these are great ideas.
Great suggestions.
Yeah. But we'll wait and see. It would be so exciting.
That is so exciting. Before we let you go, you have hinted that you are drafting something new. Are you open to giving us any hints as to what that might be, or are you keeping that still very close to yourself?
I think I'm keeping it close to myself because as I've said, I think everything I do changes. So there's probably no point saying what it is, but I will say that there is another love triangle. I can't seem to get enough of them. And that the setting it's a sort of Dorset clifftop hotel, and it's a family. So actually, I think I'm going back to I Capture the Castle a little bit. I'm sort of channeling that.
I love it.
So it's about
it's
about an eccentric family in a clifftop hotel.
Excellent. Well, that's very exciting. And before we let you go and get on with your evening, can you just tell our listeners where they can find you online?
Yes, absolutely. So I am Instagram, were you thinking?
Wherever is the best place for folks to keep up with what you're working on or to get in touch.
Oh, yes. I'm at Clare E. Empson, EMPSON is my Instagram. And I'm at Clare Empson 2 on Twitter. And I am about to have a website, which will be ClareLeslieHall.com.
Excellent. We will include links to all of those in our show notes so folks can find you, as well as the link to Buy Broken Country. And Clare, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to chat with us. This has been lovely.
Oh, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. It's been lovely.
Thanks so much, Clare. This has been great.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in picking up Clare's books, we will include links in our show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us at KoboWritingLife.com. Be sure to follow us on social media. We're at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook, X, Instagram, and Threads.
This episode was hosted by Laura Granger and Rachel Wharton, with production by Terrence Abrahams. Editing is provided by Kelly Robotham. Our theme music is composed by Tearjerker. And a huge thanks to Clare for being our guest today. If you're ready to start your publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.